Hello and welcome back to HEMAFightBreakdowns. Today I'm going to be breaking down the Tier A gold medal match between Jeffrey Wills and Stephen Cheney at AGO this past weekend. This was a really cool fight where Jeff was having an absolutely fantastic day, carved his way up through the bracket, and got to fight his instructor for the gold medal match. Given that both of these fighters are club mates, we saw a lot of really good adaptations, given that they both more or less knew how the other person was going to fence and tried to work around it. So looking at this first exchange, we see how both fencers will use their stance and their blade work in order to put up a really strong defense. Despite the fact that both fencers will have their left leg forward, keeping their right leg and their dominant leg in reserve, you might think that the purpose of this is to throw really big, heavily committed strikes or cuts or thrusts with their dominant side. However, instead, both are using their lead leg, their left leg, in order to maintain a very smart and safe distance so they can use their fast blade work to set up a very nice parry riposte, and then every once in a while, pull out that big, deep thrust or cut. As this exchange goes on, we get to the final little bit where Jeff throws a pretty committed thrust or cut towards the head, which does appear to just barely graze past the head of Steven on the right, at which point Steve sets it off a little bit more to his left side and comes down right on top with a Scheitelhaus to the top of the head. Now, this was ruled a double, as they thought that Jeff's thrust to the face had enough purchase, but looking at the slow-mo, it really did seem to appear to miss by just the slightest margin, though I can certainly understand why it was called a hit, because as you see by the footage, after the thrust misses, it kind of like gets stuck under the overlay of Cheney's mask and kind of flips it up a little bit, which gives that kind of visual feedback for the judges to pick up on, making them think that it got stuck in the overlay rather than just rubbed up against it. For the next exchange, we see a really good demonstration of how Cheney specifically, and Jeff by extension being that he's his student, use the passing step effectively to bypass some of the normal cons and constraints that using a passing step with your attacks normally allows. What we see here is that as Cheney comes forward with his attack, he is throwing his attack as his back foot is only just leaving the ground. This means that, technically speaking, he has thrown his attack before he has really managed to get much closer to his opponent. And despite that, we see that his thrust gets probably within an inch of burying itself into the bib of Jeff. Despite this, though, Jeff sets it off and throws a counterattack. But another key thing to pay attention to is that as Stephen Cheney is finishing his passing step with his right leg, he is already throwing up a defense and a parry before his right leg hits the ground. This is important because for a lot of people, the reason they feel so bad making passing steps is they always feel like they're getting overcommitted. But if you do what Cheney does here and throw your attacks at the beginning of your step, what you're effectively doing is presenting something for your opponent to parry with the knowledge that the second they make any kind of contact with it or ignore it and get stabbed, you're going to be able to immediately go into a defensive action that will keep you safe, and you can do it all while your right leg is traveling through the air, maintaining the exact distance that you want with your opponent. The reason this play was successful for Cheney here is that after his thrust is parried off to the side, he's able to put up a pretty nice hanging parry on his right side and throw a counter left sverk. And given that he threw a passing step when he threw his initial thrust, he's at the perfect range to stay at that sverk range when his foot lands, and as a result, Jeff is unable to get his sword all the way from his left side to his right side in time to parry that sverk and gets hit. Our next exchange is a pretty fancy one. Pretty much throughout the entire exchange, both Jeff and Steven are exchanging lightning fast blows and lightning fast parries, so much so that they go into their 4th, 5th, and even 6th intention before managing to get anything through. And the reason that this kind of exchange can happen is all because of the footwork that I've talked about in the previous couple exchanges. The reason that both Steven and Jeff both throw their attacks as their foot is leaving the ground is, again, so that they can throw their meaningful defense as they are ending their footwork, which means that every single one of their attacks has a defense attached to it, and that's the reason why every single time you see them throw a parry, you will see them start to move their feet and immediately throw another attack, which is parried and in turn is responded with by another counterattack. The reason this can happen is because no single one of them is committing too much footwork or too much effort to any one of their parries or riposts, which means they always have enough time to come back and defend themselves even after their attack lands or doesn't land. However, in this exchange, as we get towards the end, we see a situation where after exchanging 3 blows, Jeff attempts to throw a cut around to the opposite side, and as he does this, he goes a little bit low, almost what it looks like to Stephen Cheney's leg. Cheney parries this, feints as though he is going to throw a cut over to his right side, and instead throws a left cut over to Jeff's right side, and does appear to tag him in the shoulder a bit. Of course, after this happens, there is another continued exchange of blows, as it takes only within the span of the director saying halt for them to exchange 2 more cuts and 2 more parries before they separate again. Now, watching this back and the slow-mo footage, unfortunately, it's not the best camera footage of all time. It's actually hard to tell exactly how good the cut to the shoulder was. It did appear to hit a whole lot of guard, but I do see why it was called, because of course our blades are quite flexible, and when you parry with the flat of your sword, as Jeff was doing here when he got struck, it is sometimes common for the blow to kind of cave through the flat part of your sword, using its flexibility against it, and to tag you even though you put up a pretty significant parry. All in all, though, this fight is very, very close, and now we're going to start seeing some adaptations, because right now both fencers know that the parry repost game without much commitment isn't really going to work out well for either of them. So for our next exchange, we see our first round of adaptations. As I pointed out, Cheney has been throwing his attacks very early on in his step, and so has Jeff. But if we watch this clip very carefully, you'll notice that Cheney has thrown his initial attack ever so slightly further into his step, which means, technically speaking, he is doing so with a little bit further range and a little bit more commitment. And the pro and con of doing so is that you get your attack out a little bit slower, but you get it out a little bit further. And what you're essentially doing is you're gambling on the idea that your opponent is trying to stay out of range, and by adding a couple inches to the range of your attack, you're going to catch them unawares and tag them in the head. Jeff, for his part, has done a very good job of continuing to maintain that distance despite Cheney's increase in commitment, and parries his response, only to throw a response of his own as a shield how towards the Cheney's right shoulder. Now, unfortunately, Sean's extremely large melon gets in front of the camera, and we can't actually see whether or not good contact was made, but my expectation is that it was not great contact, as we can see the kind of flex of the blades going a little wonky about halfway down, which tells me that it was making contact with a parry before it really got close enough to hit Cheney's shoulder. Although we'll never really know for sure because of the camera angle, and it is worth pointing out that this play was thrown out as soon as it was called. So for our next exchange, we see another little adaptation here. Now, up until now, Jeff has been pretty successful, or almost successful, in getting his flat thrusting shield house into the face of Stephen Cheney. Cheney is going to make an adjustment here where when he's throwing his initial attacks, instead of throwing some flat shield house of his own, which he has thrown up until now, he's going to throw the edge down shield house, and he's going to make this change for a very specific reason, and that is the edge down shield how is actually a really great counter to the flat shield how. And here's why. When you throw a flat shield how, your blade is horizontal, which means what you're really looking to do is kind of flick your tip into a bit of a curve into the chest or neck of your opponent. Now, what the edge down shield how does is that it does a much better job of crossing the line from your dominant side to your non-dominant side. And what this does is it gives the displacement effect just enough edge so that when someone throws a flat shield how at you, your edge down shield how is going to push their tip a crucial couple inches over to one side, which, if paired with a little bit of head movement, can mean that it's very, very difficult for them to get quite enough arc to bury their tip down into your chest, and it's going to miss your head. And that's exactly what happens here. As both Jeff and Steven come forward with their shield house, Steven's edge down shield how shoves Jeff's sword just a couple inches off to his left side, which forces it to miss wide of Steven's head at the exact same time, because the flat shield how relies on the horizontal crossguard to protect from vertical threats. Jeff's flat shield-how is not high enough to protect the top of his head from the edge-down cut of Steven, and Steven manages to plink a shield-how right onto the top of Jeff right as they come together. But that's not the end of the exchange, because immediately upon feeling that contact was made with his shield-how, Steven does another really intelligent thing here, and he does a little shove in the mid-range grapple. Now, it doesn't look like much, but it's actually an extremely important thing to understand, that when you are basically running into another person while sword fighting, the most crucial thing you can do is put pressure on their hands. In order to swing your sword in any capacity, you need to be able to move your hands. And more specifically, you need to be able to move them forward. Even in these situations where you're at this kind of middle range, the ability to move your hands forward is crucial to pulling off any technique. So when Cheney comes forward and shoves Jeff's hands back towards his own face, what he's essentially doing is preventing Jeff from throwing an afterblow, generally in the form of a low right Zwerchau, because he's not going to be able to move his right arm forward enough to get his sword into presence and into an attack position. Because he shoves his hands into Jeff's face, Cheney is then able to back up and reasonably know that after his hands have just been shoved into his face, Jeff is going to have to take a moment to reassess his position and is very, very likely to put up a defensive action rather than an offensive action. So, if you're ever looking to duplicate something like this, and you like to do these shield hows, a really great idea is that right as your crosses are about to slam into each other, do what Cheney does here and show just a little bit of a shove with your arms into your opponent's hands. A little bit is all it takes to put your opponent off balance or into a position where they can't attack you back, and then, if you want to continue grappling, you can do so, or if you want to do as Steven does and back up and just wait for another opportunity, both of those options are extremely high percentage. Now, in this next exchange, we pretty much see the exact same sequence of events play out again. But I think it's worth pointing out here that we get an even better demonstration of how effective this little hand shove is. Now, again, it's worth pointing out that in the last exchange, the judges didn't think that Cheney's short edge down shield how made enough contact. But in this particular exchange, they did. And what's worth pointing out is that the setup was exactly the same. Cheney came forward with his short edge shield how at the exact same time as Jeff came forward with his flat thrusting shield how, set him off to the side, and just brought the sword down onto his shoulder. But what you also see again is that little hand shove. And this time, you see Jeff trying to throw a low right Zwerchau after they meet up, and you see that little hand shove completely shut that right Zwerchau down. You can't get a better demonstration anywhere of how effective it is to just put these little tiny shoves into your mid-range or grappling game, because it shows you just how much being on balance and being able to freely move your arms, especially when inhibited, can completely screw up your mid-range game. If Jeff had even decided to maybe pull his hands back and throw a left Zwerchau, it's entirely reasonable to believe that this shove would have had the exact same effect. And anyone who has done any kind of HEMA tournament sparring will know that in this mid-range, Zwerchaus are king. So having an option that can shut down that extremely common mid-range option is an extremely important thing to know how to do. But back to the fight. Cheney has once again landed the exact same thing as before, only this time he gets credit for it, and he is up with a commanding lead. Despite the commanding lead, Jeff has to pull out a really nice adaptation if he wants to come back into this game, and that's exactly what he does. Now, up until now, Cheney has been absolutely dominating on the initial action, and as the last two exchanges were to go off of, he's also able to ensure that he is safe in the mid-range so that he can break off contact and move back away. So Jeff is going to have another idea if he wants to get past Steven Cheney's initial action and his initial defense. And he comes up with an attack that I learned from Jake Norwood probably like 5-6 years ago, which is attack while someone else is resetting. What I mean by resetting is that something that every fencer does is after they've thrown their sequence, whatever it is they had in their mind that they wanted to do, they will often see whether or not it landed and then kind of take a small step back and reset to a starting position. This time period where someone is just finished what they thought they were going to do and then going back to their starting position is the absolute perfect time to attack people. And the reason for that is that it's often a time where they're not really thinking about what they're going to be doing next. They're thinking about what they're going to do 2 seconds from now after they've reset. And what that means is that, as you see here, after Cheney has thrown out a baited attack, which Jeff parried off to the side, he waits and looks for when Cheney tries to reset and throws a shield howl of his own towards Cheney's head. The reason it lands is not because it was especially fast or faster than some of the other ones Jeff has thrown, but because the timing of it was such that Cheney was not thinking that his opponent was going to come at him at that time, and he was currently thinking about the next exchange he was going to try to throw. This is another really crucial thing that Jeff was doing very well throughout the day, and another thing that you could learn yourself if you wanted to try to pull this move off. What you do is you essentially wait for somebody who, as Cheney has been doing up until this point, been throwing baited attacks, and then you just wait for them to reset their brain. You wait for them to go back to their starting position. And if you do this correctly, you will be able to, with a passing step, as you see from Jeff here, close that distance and throw a very meaningful and committed attack at somebody who you can pretty much guess is going to try to defend. So right now, Jeff has started his comeback, and he continues his comeback with another nice little adaptation. Cheney, as I stated before, has been dominating in the initial actions, but there is another way, besides moving backwards and parrying, that Jeff can take advantage. You see, there is a little rule in this particular tournament that said if you have managed to back your opponent out of the ring, whatever strike they throw as they're leaving will not count. And there's a really, really smart way to take advantage of the two situations that are occurring here. One is that Cheney is patiently waiting for a flat shield howl from Jeff so that he can throw his own well-timed counterattack. But he has to move backwards in order to do this. If Jeff, as he does here, will throw over and over again baited flat shield howls that aren't really intending to make it all the way to their target, what he can do is effectively back Cheney up further and further towards the edge of the ring before hopefully getting a really good parry off and throwing a final hard counter shot of his own. At the same time as this can work just on its own merits, he also knows that the further he backs up Cheney, the more likely it is that any afterblow Cheney throws might be occurring as he exits the ring. And that's exactly what Jeff pulls off here. He throws those baited shield howls. He waits for Cheney to parry them. He tries to throw hard, strong parries against the counter shots that Cheney throws back at him and waits for his opportunity, and he gets it. He throws a very hard parry to his lower left quadrant, which manages to set Cheney off while moving backwards to a place where he's not exactly comfortable being, at which point he throws a plunging short edge cut straight towards Cheney's head, which Cheney tries to lean out of the way of, but it finds that he is too close, given that he had a decision there between forcibly ejecting himself from the ring and just trying to lean out of the way of the strike. Because Jeff's counter blow came with a passing step, he was able to get more than close enough to land this blow and gets another clean 3 points. So Jeff has managed to pull this match back from the brink and has managed to turn a 7-point lead into a 6-7 almost even match. But Stephen Cheney is not one of the best in the world for no reason. He is fully aware of the adaptations that Jeff has made in order to get him those 6 points, and now he is going to use one of them against him. In the previous exchange, Jeff did a great job of trying to ring bully Stephen Cheney towards the edge of the ring. And now Cheney is going to use that exact same tactic against him, only this time it's going to work a little bit better because Cheney is the larger and likely stronger fighter here. As both of these fencers start off with this exchange, Cheney is throwing the exact same thing that Jeff was last exchange, where he's throwing fairly non-committal flat shield howls toward his opponent, basically knowing that he's going to back up and try to parry each and every one of them. But every time Cheney throws another flat shield howl forward, Jeff essentially has a choice to make. He can either continue to back up and risk leaving the ring, or he can stand still, hope that he can parry the attack effectively, and then throw an effectively strong counterattack afterwards. And what we see here is that because Stephen Cheney is not putting any real commitment into his flat shield howls, what happens is that eventually Jeff decides to stand still, fails to parry a flat slap to the top of the shoulder, and then even though that maybe shouldn't have counted, his counterattack, after presumably trying to parry that attack, isn't able to really make it to its mark, and Cheney is able to once again employ the hand push to ensure that Jeff, once again has an impossible choice to make. When he gets his hands shoved, he can either try to throw some kind of cut, which will very likely not land with any quality because his hands are getting pushed, or continue to back up and once again risk leaving the ring. So while this particular exchange didn't seem to go off of any particular attack, it shows very much what the change in tactics has been for Stephen Cheney and how he plans on winning the rest of this match. Utilizing the exact same tactics from last exchange, Stephen Cheney comes in once again with a very hard attack on his left side. Jeff, who is now making the decision to stand and parry, finds that he is able to parry the attack from Stephen, only to throw in a counterattack of his own on his low left side and to find it parried again. The reason this is happening is because despite the fact that Cheney is showing that he's throwing a little bit more commitment into his initial attacks, he is still fast enough to pull out of them and throw up a meaningful defense onto what he expects is the most obvious counterattack his opponent is going to throw. It is worth pointing out that while 90% of the time it is extremely intelligent to parry on one side and then to throw a counterattack on the other, ensuring that your opponent has to cross their entire body line in order to defend themselves, that this can also sometimes become predictable. And that is exactly what has happened here. Jeff has gotten a successful parry and has thrown the exact same counterattack that he has thrown the last 3 times he has gotten a successful parry. And Cheney, for his credit, has already started to move in that section the exact moment his attack is parried. As a result, he is able to successfully parry Jeff's counterattack and throw a very strong counterattack of his own, a left Zwerkow that manages to collapse its way through Jeff's parry and hit him on the shoulder. As mentioned before, one of the reasons this happens is that Jeff is throwing the parry on his right side with the flat of his blade, which does not offer quite enough structure to defend him, and it results in him losing another crucial 2 points towards his loss. So as it stands now, Cheney is 1 point away from winning, and Jeff is going to have to pull out something crazy if he wants to win. And to his credit, he goes back to something that had worked to him previously, the exact kind of ring bullying that Stephen had been inflicting on him earlier. However, as I mentioned earlier, whenever you try to ring bully someone, you give them a choice. Either walk backwards and risk leaving the ring, or stand and parry. And Stephen chooses to stand and parry. Jeff throws a very heavy committed attack that was clearly trying to force Stephen Cheney back, but instead of moving backwards, Cheney plants his feet, throws a nice parry up in his high left side, and then throws a plunging counterattack down towards Jeff's head. Jeff, in order to get away from it, sinks his hips low and continues to drive forward into grapple range, and once again finds himself at the victim of the hand push. Stephen Cheney simply plants his hands directly onto the top of Jeff's head, which effectively pins his sword and his hands to his face, making him basically blind and unable to throw any kind of attack or defense. Now, from this position, Cheney attempts to do a 2-handed pommel attack, which, in my opinion, wasn't necessarily the best choice. It probably would have been a little bit more effective to disconnect his left hand, simply continue to shove it into Jeff's right hand, and effectively know that he would be able to shut down this exchange right here and now. However, after he shoves down and throws this little pommel attack, he takes a step back and attempts to throw a left Zwerk over the top. Now, Jeff, who has had this happen to himself more than twice now, knows exactly what's going to happen after Cheney moves backwards from his hand push. He's going to throw an attack. And Jeff attempts to throw the most logical counterattack to what he expects that attack is going to be, a low right Zwerk. The idea here is that if he throws the low right Zwerk and he gets his ox position up high enough, he'll actually be able to meaningfully defend himself from any attack on that quadrant. However, because Cheney is a good bit taller than him, and Jeff had to sink his hips quite a bit low in order to get underneath of Cheney's pommel attack, he ends up too low, and his right Zwerk hits Cheney more or less in the leg or the hip. At the exact same time, his hands aren't quite high enough or far enough to the side to defend him from Cheney's counterattack, and he gets hit in the head. Now, the judges call this a kind of no exchange, but in my opinion, even if they had called it a double, it still would have been a very good demonstration of why, if you know what to do, and especially if you utilize this hand push, you can utilize a standing parry kind of situation when someone else is trying to bully you to great effect. So at this point, the previous exchange was thrown out, despite the fact that I don't really think it should have, and Stephen Cheney is still only 1 point away from victory. But it is worth pointing out that if Jeff manages to get a clean headshot, he can still win this. And so it is with that context that I believe Jeff made the decision to switch back to a more defensive mode. Given that his attempts to continue to bully Cheney have not worked, and his attempts to basically reassert any of the things that he did before that got him those 3 points have also not worked, he's essentially looking for new options. And that new option is to basically wait for an overcommitted attack from Cheney and to try to capitalize on a single standing parry. However, this does not work out for him very well. And one of the reasons it doesn't work out is because Cheney utilizes something that Jeff used on him earlier, which is to attack during the pause and the reset. What you see here is that Cheney is throwing some baited attacks forward, Jeff is attempting to parry them, and perhaps committing a little bit too much to some of these parry. And what that means is that Cheney can look for the reset. The second he throws out a baited attack, and Jeff parries it, and decides not to throw a counterattack, he is going to try to reset to a starting position, and that is the perfect time to throw a thrust directly at him. Now, for the record, looking at the footage, it's actually pretty unclear whether or not Cheney's initial thrust here lands properly. The quality just isn't quite there, and it would have landed on the wrong side of the camera. However, that, as far as I understand, is what the judges saw. It looks like that thrust was set aside just enough that it missed the chest, but maybe buried itself into the arm. Either way, though, after this happens, Jeff throws a counterattack of his own, thinking that he got the parry off, and we once again have a Sean Franklin Mellon situation, where I can't see for sure whether or not this counterattack actually meaningfully lands. So for all I know, the first attack missed and Jeff's follow-up landed, but I can't see, and so I can't say for sure. But after that, both fencers separate, they throw some more counterattacks, but given that they're further out of range, neither one of them can really meaningfully land, and the fight is stopped. 2 points is awarded to Stephen Cheney, and he wins the fight. But it's still worth pointing out here that there were a ton of really cool adaptations and use of techniques in this fight, and it's one that is pretty easy to learn from. The attack during the reset and the hand push being the two key things that you could take away from this and probably try to insert into your own training. But if you would like to see more fights from AGO, I will be publishing my third place fight there on Thursday, and hopefully you'll still be there to see it.